A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
We're going to be talking about our Christian gospel and understanding the rise of Islam. And, of course, all of that in relation to the huge developments in the Middle East over the weekend. You might have caught the news. The Hezbollah leader, Hassan Nasrallah, was eliminated in a targeted airstrike in Lebanon. In fact, Israel says more than 20 Hezbollah members were eliminated in that airstrike. So we're turning our attention to the growing number of Muslims in Australia and how we as Christian believers understand the threats and the opportunities created by growing Islamic presence in Australia as those ripple effects from what go on in the Middle East go all around the world. And you might not appreciate, but at the last census, Muslim numbers were up over 800,000 in Australia, representing more than 3% of our population. Well, our special guest today says in some cities, like, for instance, the city of Brisbane, the number of Muslims has doubled in the last 15 years. Well, our special guest, Australian Christian expert on Islam, Dr. Bernie Power from the Melbourne School of Theology is joining us. Dr. Bernie Power has lived and worked in several Muslim countries over many years. He speaks and reads Arabic. He teaches the Quran, the Hadith, and Muslim thought at the Melbourne School of Theology. He's written numerous books on the Muslim-Christian interface, and he is our guest, Dr. Bernie Power. A special welcome back to 2020.
Great to be with you, Neil. Great to be with your listeners too.
Bernie, let's start with the developments in the Middle East. More than 20 Hezbollah members, including Hassan Nasrallah, eliminated in that airstrike on the weekend. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, pretty courageous kind of step by Israel. So they're fighting the war down in Gaza Strip against Hamas, and it's not quite going as well as they'd hoped or thought it would go. And at the same time, as soon as Hamas attacked Israel from the south, Hezbollah from Lebanon in the north started bombing Israel from the day after, on October the 8th they started. And that's been going on for now nearly a year. And Israel has been fighting back, but then they've also now moved their focus more towards Hezbollah and did this incredible step of taking out Hassan Nasrallah and a whole lot of other leaders, as you mentioned before. So it looks like there'll probably be a ground invasion from Israel going into the south of Lebanon. I would imagine reasonably soon, and the fighting will ramp up a bit there in the north.
A ground invasion into Lebanon. And I wonder really at the early part of our conversation here, Bernie, your insight here, as Christians, we're looking on a war between, we might say, the Israelis and those Islamists in Hezbollah, and we are trying to make sense of those things and looking for biblical perspectives here. And, of course, when we talk about Judeo-Christian, we're talking about a Christian alignment with the Judeo-ethic of the Old Testament. How do you see Christians looking at the events as we're seeing them unfold on our screens?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Christians would take two kind of different perspectives, and so those who would see the part of the role of Israel at the end times as really kind of crucial, and some would even see things like the development of the temple, the rebuilding of the temple, and that being a precursor for the coming of Jesus. For them, they'd be watching this with great interest, with the understanding that this could be a sign of kind of the end times. But other Christians who would take what they call a covenant theology would say, well, actually, Israel has been the chosen people, but then as the churches come along, they've taken that role in the fulfillment of those promises to Israel. And so they wouldn't have placed as much emphasis on the political events there, or at least seeing them from an eschatological perspective. So I speak at lots of churches, and depending on which perspective, sometimes it's a denominational thing, so some denominations would take the much more dispensational Christian Zionist perspective, and others much more what we call federalist or covenant theology perspective. So there's a bit of a division amongst Christians in terms of where this goes and what it actually means.
So there is a division, a dispensationalist view or a covenant theology view as to how you might see things in an eschatological sense. But our conversation today is not necessarily about an eschatological sense, because we're going to be talking about threats with the rise of Islam, and what's happening in the Middle East, no doubt, is continuing to fuel even Islamic fervour in Australia. I wonder if you can reflect on, what's happened even since October 7th and all of the things that have developed here in Australia, because Islamic fervour seems to be hitting a fever pitch.
Yep. So there's been a couple of things. One is just the whole question of the position of the Palestinian people, and that's been a bit of a lightning fuse for Muslims. Decades, like ever since 1948, when the State of Israel was established. And for Muslims, that was a problem, not only because it was Israel, which had been kind of the sworn enemies of Islam right from the very beginning, from the days of Muhammad, but also the fact that they had taken possession of what the Muslims consider to be Islamic lands. So there's a thinking within Islamic theology that once Islam controls a land, that land must be forever Islamic. It can never be handed back to non-Muslims. And, of course, after the death of Muhammad, Islam expanded greatly throughout the whole of the Middle East, North Africa, and even into parts of Europe. So they ruled over Spain and Portugal for 700 years, and they consider that to be still Islamic land. And so when this group of Jews came and took possession of a great part of the land of Israel, which the Muslims call Palestine, that this was a terrible thing for them, in that this land had now been taken back by non-believers. So that was also a part of the equation for them.
And, just take us a little deeper here, Bernie, because while we're thinking of Islamic lands and Islam, 6th, 7th century, what we're seeing as Islamic lands now were, in fact, many of those were previously what you'd call Christian lands, like the Assyrian nations there across the Middle East. I wonder if you've got any perspective there, because Christians did have control of a lot of that territory originally.
Yeah, totally. And in fact, all of it. So when Muhammad died, the only part of land that he'd occupied was the Arabian Peninsula. So everything kind of east to the east of the Jordan River, down, all the way down to Mecca, Medina, Yemen, Oman, those areas, Saudi Arabia. But after he died, then the Islamic forces pushed out of that area and began invading and occupying all the lands around them. So they started off with the ones which were closest, which was Israel and Palestine, which were under the rule of the Byzantines. So they were Christian, part of the Christian Empire, and then they moved across through Egypt again, which was Coptic Church, and then across to Libya, Morocco, Algeria, and then cross over into Spain and Portugal. Within 100 years, they had occupied 2/3 of Christendom. So it was just an incredible exchange or overrun of power of the Muslim forces. They didn't lose a major battle in that first 100 years. So these were all previously, so places like Turkey, the west part of Iraq were all Christian lands, and all the other areas around there, Syria, Lebanon, were all under Christian rule, and they were the majority of the populations were Christian at that time.
So when we've got Islam discovering they can take territory and keep it by force and introduce another religious dimension to people's lives and enforce that in a way that enforcement even still looks today, I wonder if you've got any thoughts on what it is with war and terror and violence that fuels this Islamic fervour and, of course, anti-Semitism, as we've seen on our streets here in Australia. But what's fueling those things right around the world, it's a strategic use of war and terror, isn't it?
Yeah, and Muhammad himself said, Allah has made me victorious through terror. So he, when he started out in Mecca, received his so-called call to prophethood back in 610 AD. He was 40 years old, and from those first 12 years, he was stuck in Mecca, making little impact, preaching, but not seeing many people turning to his religion. And then when he moved to Medina in 622, he's now 54 years old. He took with him the 200 followers that he'd gained from Mecca, and they established an Islamic state in Medina at the invitation of the local people of Medina. And then they began their military expansion. And over the next 10 years before he died at age 62 or 63, he was able to gain control militarily of the whole of the Arabian Peninsula. And this was all endorsed through revelations that he received, or that he said that he received from Allah, telling him to go and wage war to fight against the unbelievers, verses like kill them wherever you can find them, and subdue them. So this became a part of the understanding of how Islam was to be expanded. And so when Muhammad died, that program simply continued, and we saw the success of it militarily, overrunning Christian lands, not only Christian lands, but also Persia, which was Zoroastrian, and then pushing right across to the borders of India. So Pakistan, Afghanistan, all of these lands, which they were Buddhist lands, some of them. So basically overrunning wherever they could and taking control and establishing an Islamic state there.
So Islamic military conquest, that is a part of the history since the 6th and 7th century. Is it the case, Bernie, and I hope I'm not taking us too far off track because I want to come back to Muslims in Australia, but is it the case that in a lot of those circumstances, the Christians who had control of the land didn't fight back, or were they not strong enough to defend the territory that was Christian? Any thoughts here on how those sorts of military conquests took so much ground?
Yeah, so there are a couple of factors going on there. Firstly, the Byzantines, the Eastern Roman Empire, had been fighting a war with the Persians, the Zoroastrians, for about 100 years. So it had been going on for quite a long time, and they kind of fought each other to a standstill. So they'd expended all their resources, and people were a little bit sick of war. And so when the Muslims came, they came in basically and chased out the Byzantines, overran the Persians. And as they occupied a land, they would say to the people or to the armies, if you join us, then we will go on to the next land and we'll occupy that. And the way that they paid people was it wasn't a professional army, but through booty. So if you attacked and gained control of a city, then you would have access to all of the treasure of that city, gold, silver, animals, wealth, and even the people. So people were enslaved. And so there was an incentive for these nations, once they'd been occupied by the Muslims, to then join and add to the juggernaut that just continued on. So that kind of made it a success that was feeding upon itself. At the same time, we saw there were divisions within the other groups. So there'd been fighting, there'd been assassinations of leaders and all those kinds of things, and the Muslims were able to take advantage of all of those things.
So you've got a divided Christian population, makes them an easy target for an organised Muslim Islamic army. That's a very, very interesting topic, and maybe we can explore that some more. But let's bring our attention to what's happening here on our shores in Australia, because we're not immune to those things that have been going on in the Middle East. In fact, you've just got to look at the news headlines and the sorts of protests that have been happening on our streets since October 7 last year. But Muslims in Australia are growing very strongly, and as I said in the introduction there, Bernie, doubling in the city of Brisbane over just 15 years. How do you reflect on the growth of Muslims, but then of the religion of Islam, with those numbers exceeding that sort of growth?
Yes, so we're seeing growth, and it's happening mostly, through two things. One would be through immigration. So there's about 70% of the world's refugees are Muslim. So they're seeking to flee from the Muslim countries. So Islam isn't working terribly well for them, and they're looking to come to Western countries. And so many of them come here as refugees, and legitimately. You know, we've had some living with us in our house. Muslims who have been fleeing from terrible situations that they've been facing and needing somewhere to live, and so we've had them come and live with us. And so it's important that we, understand that that's the case. But there's also the political element of it, that the Islamic groups are organising themselves, and particularly in this last year, there's been an incredible change. The British elections at the end of last year, which brought Labor into power, even though there was a landslide from the Labor perspective, a group called Muslim Votes Matter arose, and they were able to organise themselves and take seats from the Labor Party during that election. And we've got a similar kind of organisation with the same name here in Australia, which is planning to do the same in the upcoming federal elections early next year. So they're organising themselves so that's happening. So we're seeing both numerical growth, but also an increase in political organisation, but also in radicalisation. That's the other thing that's happening. On the streets of Melbourne yesterday, people were flying the Hezbollah flag, and Hezbollah is a designated terrorist organisation. They're banned in Australia and in many other countries because of the stuff that they've been doing, not just recently, but over the decades. So from the 1980s, Hezbollah has been active as a terrorist organisation, and here it's getting support because of this war that's happening in the Middle East.
Now, of course, you've got those protests on the streets. You've got the threats of violence, and even the threat can be, I guess, a form of terror. When there are terror attacks, that's all the more virulent. And then you've got the political uprising. And now, for Christians, some will be saying, well, we better go and hide. We better get out of the way and not be a part of this. There's an opportunity you've identified here, and that comes around what we all call as Christians evangelism. What's the opportunity here, Bernie?
Yeah, it's great. So every Saturday, a group of us get out onto the streets of Melbourne. And it happens in other places as well. There's Muslims are out there actively promoting their faith. So besides being politically active, they're also active in terms of a religious sense and out there trying to promote Islam as a religion of peace. The Quran as the best book in the world, Muhammad as the perfect human being. So this is part of their narrative, and then they criticise Christianity, saying, well, you've got a Bible that's corrupted, you've got churches that are divided or empty, you've got poor theology, and so they'll tackle that. And typically when we go to talk to them, they will immediately start challenging or questioning or criticising Christianity and Western civilization. So that's part of their thing. So we felt we needed to be out there actually with a different narrative. So we're out there, and our headline, we've got tables there with banners saying, we are Christians sharing Jesus, engaging with Islam. And each week Muslims would come and talk to us, or we'd go and talk to them and get an opportunity to share the gospel.
Before we take any calls, Bernie, let me just draw your attention to some of the religious differences that are going on even in the Middle East, where you've got Sunnis and Shias, because you've got Iran that's Shia, Hezbollah is Shia, but you're saying that Hamas is actually Sunni. The interesting and powerful dimension here is that typically within Islam, the Sunnis and the Shias basically hate each other. So how does all this work together?
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing. So the real kind of push behind all of this has been Iran. So they've got international aims and expectations. So from the Iranian Revolution in 1979, they were able to establish an Islamic state or a Shia state, and they wanted to export that to the world. And so they then tapped into the other Shia groups around the Middle East, and there were substantial Shia populations in not only in Iran where they based, but also in Iraq and in Lebanon, some in Syria, but also in Yemen as well. The Houthis are a brand of Shia Islam. And of course, Islam is quite clearly historically divided between the Sunni and the Shia. The Sunnis are about 85-90% of the population, so the Shias 10 to 15%, and they tend to be concentrated in those areas. And the Iranians saw an opportunity with Hamas to be able to what they thought was bloody the nose of the Israelis, and so they've been supplying them with arms and equipment through Hezbollah, who is also another Iranian funded group based in Lebanon, in the south of Lebanon. So it's interesting to see this cooperation between these two groups who wouldn't necessarily. In fact, when the Islamic State was at its power in the early 2000s, Hezbollah sent troops to fight against the Islamic State because they were Sunni, and of course Hezbollah is Shia. So this division, it's interesting they've been able to overlook these divisions and to work together with Sunni and Shia together.
So Hamas is Sunni, Hezbollah is Shia, and so is Iran, and they typically, on any other day, hate each other, except when their common hatred together of Israel unites them. Is that a fair enough way of explaining just how that all works?
Yeah.
Hey, summary. And of course here in Australia, 90% of Australian Muslims are Sunnis. Where does that work with, who cooperates with who in their own protests and those threats of violence that happen even on our streets?
Well, it's interesting. The group that's actually organising all of these it's not primarily coming from Islamic groups. So the marches in the streets are actually mostly coming out of the radical Marxist groups. So the groups like the Socialist Alternative and other groups like that. So they tend to organise a march, at least in Melbourne. So we have our street outreach in the centre of the city each Saturday and one on Sunday, and we would see these groups, and they change their theme each week depending on what the flavour of the week is, whether it's save the whales or tax reform or whatever. And they've just picked up on the Palestine one because that was a convenient one for them to do, and they got the Muslims mobilised. And we're seeing they're the ones who are actually driving this and pushing it forward. And the Muslims are coming on and now taking a much more kind of prominent, at least public role. But the impetus came from these socialist groups.
Wow. Socialist, Marxist, mobilising the Muslim population here in Australia. Hey, taking calls, 1-800 316 316. You might like to join in our conversation. You might have an insight you'd like to offer. Let's take a call. Vince is in Brisbane. Hey, Vince, welcome along.
Yeah. Hi, Neil. Hi, Dean.
Vince, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, soon after October 7th, over a few months, I've wrote a really detailed essay about my thoughts on this issue. I clashed with people at church over it, and I could talk 100 points. But what I'll say is I think it's important to note there's never been any such thing as a Palestinian nation. To begin with, like the original Arab migration there, started after the Byzantine, the conquest of when it was under the Byzantine Empire, right? But if you look at the modern-day Palestinians of today, only, from an Israeli source, only a tiny percentage could trace their family back to that time. Most of them would only be, say, from the 1850s, and that's around the time there was a Jewish migration too. I think a lot of land too. I think was bought under the Rothschilds. Was purchased under the Rothschilds, and
Vince,
where Jews ended up living.
You're making some good points here. Let's come back to Bernie, though, on this issue, the Palestinian state idea, Palestinian land. Vince is saying that's just, I guess he's saying, and maybe I'm reading between the lines here, a bit like an excuse for the sorts of wars that are going on. But what are your thoughts, Bernie?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So the name Palestine originally came from the Philistines, and it was used as a bit of a derogatory term by the Emperor Hadrian. So the Jews had been in the land for centuries, and from the time of the Exodus, and the Romans occupied them, as did many other people. But the Jews were particularly fractious, and the Romans didn't like them, and so they wanted to expel them from the land, which they did. So Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, and there was another big destruction in 135 AD. And to get rid of the Jewish history, they renamed it Syria Palestinia. So it's like Syrian Palestine. And it was kind of to pretend that the Jews hadn't been there or had no kind of claim on the land. And so the Palestinian name was actually then revived by the British when they were given it as a mandate. It had been under the Ottomans for centuries, and when they lost the First World War, then all these lands were taken over by Western powers, and so the British inherited it or given it by the League of Nations, and so they ruled it, and they called it Palestine. And there had been an indigenous Arab population there for a long time, just as there had been Jews there through all that period. And he mentioned about the Rothschilds funding the purchase of the land, which they did. The Jews, as they and it started from the late 1800s. Many Jews started emigrating to Israel, Palestine, to establish an Islamic state, which didn't happen. An Israeli state, which didn't happen until 1948. So there was this bit of a question about the history for some of the people there, but other Palestinians would say, well, look, we've been here, from 2,000 years, so we do have a kind of a place in the land.
What an amazing historic insight! Almost the production of a reason that might say, and I think you said an excuse or to be able to pretending, I think was your word, pretending that the Israeli state had never been there before. I want to thank Vince for his critical historic view there. Thank you, Vince, for your call. 1-800-316-316. If you'd like to join in our conversation, let's hear from Graham in Tasmania. Hey, Graham, welcome.
Good morning, gentlemen. We're living in very interesting times,
Graham, we're getting a bit of feedback there. Just up close on your phone there.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. Well, we're living in the times when the Western world, the so-called Christian world, turned from God, and Matthew 24 talks about a great deception. And our nations, when that happens, is not that far away. Israel's got us preparing to sacrifice. It wants a treaty. It wants a treaty that they can sacrifice on the Temple Mount, should I say. And the Muslims and deceived Christianity are going to join together. Those who are true Christians, acknowledge Jesus Christ, will die. They will not take the mark of the beast. And this, the deceived Christianity, are going to go along with this. And there's going to be a great butchery on the face of the earth. But,
Graham, good insight there, and it harkens back to some comments we made a little earlier about how you interpret those events that are unfolding there in the Middle East. Bernie, a thought or two for Graham?
Yeah, certainly. Like if you read the book of Revelation in this great kind of poetic descriptions of disasters that are going to come at the end of time, and there'll be an apostasy, a turning away, which Jesus also talked about. And we could well be in those times when this is the period where people are losing faith. We're seeing the church, particularly in the West, having decreasing numbers and decreasing impact in some places, particularly in the West, in some areas. But in other places, the church is growing, and we're seeing this massive revival. I get to speak at churches almost every week, and I speak at churches which are full of people from Asia, from Africa, from South America. So those churches are growing. So the church is growing internationally, but it's in decline, at least in numbers in Australia. So I'm not sure. I don't know God's timeline of when things are going to happen, but I think it's important that we keep an eye on those things and that we respond appropriately. And Matthew 24 talks about this good news of the kingdom will be preached to all nations, and then the end will come. And I think it gives us that kind of evangelistic imperative that we respond in that way. No matter what else is happening, we don't give up. Jesus says, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So there's no reason for Christians to be pessimists about the future. We need to respond to the situations and to the context and to the opportunities that we have at each time for our time.
I want to thank Graham in Tasmania for his call, 1-800-316-316, to join in our conversation. Let's touch on this for a few moments, because people might not be appreciative of just how important the message of the Christian gospel is and the way it's delivered through what we call Christian evangelism. But there seems to be a trend in Australia, Bernie, downplays the role of Christian evangelism, almost discourages believers from diligent attempts at bringing the gospel and leading people through to a decision to follow Christ. What are your thoughts about our trends in Australia around evangelism?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things going on. So one of it, people are a bit fearful. So, this concern about political correctness and, people being fearful of, can I can I share the gospel with my Muslim neighbour? And, how would I do that? Which is why we're actually running these seminars. So on Saturday, on the 19th of October, we'll run a seminar at St. Paul's Presbyterian Church in Spring Hill called Sharing Jesus with Our Muslim Neighbours, including in that there'll be a visit to a mosque. So we'll go down to one of the local mosques and engage with the Muslim leader there and be able to have a Q&A session to understand their perspective. But I think it's important that we take out the fear and the doubt that people have. A lot of people have, losing confidence in the gospel, and Muslims will play on that in terms of challenging your beliefs. So we'll have a training seminar before the mosque visit, which will talk about how to respond to the major objections and criticisms that Muslims would raise, and how we can do that confidently and clearly with Muslim people.
And interestingly, to pick up on this, when you've got a Christian group coming to a mosque and wanting to engage with the imam that might be leading that mosque, at this point in Australia, there's a welcoming of this sort of debate. Is that the way it works?
Yeah, well, it depends. So, obviously Muslims will have an agenda there that they want to present Islam in the most positive and attractive way that as they can. And I think it's and others would also have the perspective, well, we're really all the same. We all believe in the one God, and there's really no difference between us. And I think both of those need to be addressed. And one of the talks I'll give on is Allah of the Quran the same as the God of the Bible, and talk about the significant differences in there which make me say no, that they're not the same. And I think it's important that we engage them. And, the gospel that we've got is something that you don't find within Islam, that there's a God who is willing to do everything he can to save us, to the extent of even taking on human body, human nature, and dying on the cross for us. So that idea of a God who is a servant, a God who's willing to sacrifice himself, God who is a rescuer, is a concept that's not found within Islam.
A powerful clarification. The God of Islam, Allah, and the God of the Bible are not the same God. 1-800-316-316. Let's take another call. Mike is in Adelaide. Hey, Mike, welcome.
Hello, yes. How are you? Yeah.
Good, Mike.
Great.
What are your thoughts for our conversation?
That we should walk with beautiful feet. I think you talked to me about this once, with our Muslim friends, whatever their background. And as Abraham was called to be a blessing and bless all nations, we should look at ways how we simply bless them and love them. As our speaker said, the God of Islam, as is the God of many other works-based religions, is a deception. But Jesus shows us the God of love. And so here's an example. I'm in a park with a friend talking about how can we bless people. A couple of people from Iran were having a barbecue who went over and we said, it smells good. And then we got talking and I said, what are you thankful for? He said, we're so glad to be in Australia. And then I said, what are you stressed about? Oh, we need a job. I said, can I bless you in Jesus' name? And I'll pray for that job. Yes, please. We did that. He phoned back and I helped him get a job and we're in touch now. Another friend was a carer, came to church and he was just there at church and I said, oh, hi, what are you thankful for? He said, I'm thankful to be in Australia. And then I said, are you stressed about, my wife's been stuck in Iraq for 5 years. I'll pray for that. Can I pray in Jesus' name? He's able to work miracles. Yes, please. So I prayed, and a few weeks later he was at a Christmas event, and he said, Mike, it's a miracle. My wife is here just after you prayed.
Mike, what an amazing contribution you're making to our conversation today. Hey, Bernie, how do you feel when you hear Mike reflecting those things?
Oh, I just feel a very warm heart. Yeah, thanks, Mike, for sharing that. And I think that's really important. One of the things we need to do is to diffuse the fear, because there's a lot that we can be fearful of and afraid of, to kind of dispel the doubts and just to encourage people with love. You know, that we can go into these situations. The love of Christ compels us and sends us out to people so we can do things. And our Muslim neighbours and contacts and friends just don't understand this. You know, they would say to us, well, why are you doing this? You know, having people live with you when, you know, they're not your relatives, they're not your friends, they're people you never even met before. You know, why are you opening up your home to them? You know, why do you respond positively to people and friendly? I do debates with Muslims. I did one just a couple of weeks ago on the street. A Muslim guy, the team turned up there with a camera and said, can we have a street debate? And I said, sure. So they did. And then at the end of it, and it was quite, what should I say? It was a bit fiery at times. This guy was wanting to kind of take me down as a Christian. At the end, I said, let me give you a hug, because even though we disagree very strongly on these very important things, we can still be friends and respond to each other in positive ways. He didn't quite know how to respond. That wasn't kind of part of his plan, part of the agenda. But, you know, because we go to people with a heart of love, even if they reject us, even if they oppose us, we still love them. And I think that's really key.
Wow. And expressions of kindness and love are very disarming. They're not expecting that. And being able to have substance in winning a debate the way you can do too, Bernie Power, just outstanding. Thank you so much to Mike in Adelaide for your call. Let's see if we can squeeze in another call or two. Time's running short. Let's hear from Alfie in Corrigan in WA. Hey, Alfie, welcome.
Hello, Neil. Hello, Bernie. How's it going?
Doing good. What are your thoughts, Alfie?
Just with the Muslims, I heard this Arabian proverb. It says, if you let a camel put its head in the tent, it'll eventually move in. And with the Afghans coming here, they brought all the camels in, and like the people around, all the Aboriginal people in the arid areas, they came in contact with them, but they could see the difference between the God, you know, the God of the Bible and the God of the Quran. And Aboriginal people worship Jesus. You know what I mean? They can see the difference. And just another thing with with you questioning the Muslims, I just wonder, with there's so much pornography problems in Australia, we have an answer through Jesus, but what is their answer to pornography? Can you give me some idea on that?
Alfie,
or is there
taking us a little bit out on a tangent here, but if there's a quick response from Bernie.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the question of pornography is a fascinating one. A guy called Waleed Ali, who's a Melbourne academic and TV personality, wrote a book called People Like Us. And in it, he points out, he did a survey of the access to pornography based on nations. And he said, I think it's like 4 of the top 5 nations for accessing pornography are Muslim majority nations. And he said this is despite the fact that they, often they have very poor internet connections and, poor infrastructure. They're still doing that. So it's a real problem within Muslim communities. It's a problem here in Australia too, but at quite a different level. So I think that's important because sometimes Muslims will criticise Christianity and the West and say, well, you're steeped in this kind of stuff. And it's a little bit like the pot calling the kettle black. So the problem is an international one. It's not just something that happens in one country or another. And you mentioned the question about the Aboriginal people. You're right. As the missionaries went to the Aboriginal people, they responded, and the figures are quite significant of the number of Aboriginal people who would count themselves as Christians. And within Islam, there is a bit of a movement there, but it's still it's very small. There's not many Aboriginal people who've converted to Islam. You see guys like Anthony Mundine, who's pretty high profile, but he's really represents quite a small number within the Aboriginal community who've become Muslim.
Alfie, we'll have to call that one. Thank you so much for your great insight today, Alfie. We won't be able to take any more calls, but let's squeeze in one more. We're going a little bit over time. Let's hear from Steve in Victoria. Steve, need to be quick. What are your thoughts?
Good morning. Just from an evangelisation point of view, I understand that the Muslims do see Jesus as a prophet as well, and is that like a point of commonality that we can point people towards, that they do recognise Jesus and we see Jesus as God, but they don't? So how do we work that?
Fabulous question. Bernie?
Yeah, so I was actually asked to speak at a mosque opening a couple of years ago. The Imam had heard me speak at a church and said, would you come and speak at our mosque? We're opening it. So I said, great. And so I did. I said, look, as Christians and Muslims, we disagree on a lot of things. Let's not pretend that we're all the same. But we do agree on some things about Jesus. And so I talked about what the Quran teaches about Jesus, that he was born of a virgin, so they believe in the virgin birth, that he performed miracles, he healed the sick and he raised the dead, that he was able to change the law, and a whole lot of things in the Quran which talk about the greatness of Jesus. And the last one I picked up was on is a verse in the Quran which says, Jesus is exalted, highly exalted in this world and in the next. And I said, that's exactly what the Bible teaches about Jesus. And I quoted from Philippians 2, 8 to 10. It says, therefore, God has highly exalted him and given him the name that is above every other name. At the name of Jesus, every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. And I said, as Christians and Muslims, this is something we can believe, we can agree on, the greatness and the majesty of Jesus. So I think that's a great, and I built my case from the material that was in the Quran, ultimately leading to that one. So I think that's a great starting point. And when I'm talking with Muslims, I'll often start with, well, let's have a look at what the Quran teaches and then build on to that to what the Bible teaches. I don't believe that the Jesus in the Quran is the same as the Jesus in the Bible. You mentioned there, that, Steve, that he's only a prophet, and it kind of diminishes who he is. And so I think it's important that we point out to people that the picture of Jesus in in the Bible is a much more magnificent, glorious, exalted being than just being a human prophet.
Wonderful insight. Thank you so much, Steve in Victoria. Time has run out. And just to reiterate that Bernie Power, who's based in Victoria, is going to be in Queensland and for a mid-October set of meetings. And I'm going to give a website in a few moments for people who are in Brisbane, southeast Queensland, even northern New South Wales, to be a part of those meetings. But Dr. Bernie Power, who is an expert, a Christian expert on Islam, from the Melbourne School of Theology, he's written numerous books on the Muslim-Christian interface. And in Brisbane, if you're interested in these things, and who wouldn't be, you might want to be at these events, 14th, 15th and 16th of October, and again on the 19th. But on the 14th at St. Stephen's Anglican Church, the 15th at Grace House Church in Slacks Creek, Bridgeman Downs Baptist Church on the 16th, and a special seminar on Saturday the 19th at St. Paul's Presbyterian Church in Spring Hill, and on the 19th, an opportunity to visit a mosque and engage with the imam there. You'll be a group welcomed to a Brisbane mosque, and you'll be a part of seeing a demonstration of how this sort of beautiful relationship can work, as Bernie puts on the debater and also that gentleness and the beautiful feet that were talked about a little earlier. Bernie, time has run out, but here's the website to be able to connect with what's happening in Brisbane, bernieinbrisbane.com. That's Bernie, B-E-R-N-I-E, bernieinbrisbane.com, a special website that's set up for those meetings. Bernie Power, I look forward already to the next time we get to talk, but thanks so much for sharing your heart with us today on 2020.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.